Hi, I'm Andrew McCrae. Welcome to our farm and ranch in northwest Missouri. My great-great-grandfather settled here in 1910, and I'm the fifth generation to grow crops and livestock here. As a farmer myself, I know the highs and lows of this life, the issues we confront every day, some new, some as old as farming itself. This show is a place to talk with farmers and others in the ag industry about topics that mean something to us, topics that can improve the present and future of our operations. This is Farming the Countryside. Welcome to Farming the Countryside. Dean Wysocki and Gary Lezak join me to talk some weather, and people are always interested in the weather, I think. Guys, I appreciate you joining me. Gary, for those that have not heard you before, there's something called the LRC. Tell them what it is.
It's really interesting. It is rocket science. It's that difficult. And so we'll try to sort it out and simplify it. But it's something I discovered back in 1987, 1980. The patterns were cycling, and you can trace it all the way back into the 1940s when this guy, Jerome Demayas, discovered something very similar. However, what it's all about is the weather pattern above us, the river of air that goes across North America through the westerly belt, across to Europe, Asia, and then back around across the Pacific. That jet stream flow, that river of air above us, has an order to it. And so there's a regular cycle. And that's what the LRC is all about. We are able, with now so many years of practicing it, 20 to 30 years of using it, we are able to predict when and where and a little bit of the what. So when, where, and a little bit of the what. Then these other things like La Nina, El Nino, Arctic oscillation, they're influences that might help us with the what. But that's what the LRC is all about. The weather pattern cycling, it provides the centerpiece of this big jigsaw in the atmosphere, allowing us to make predictions for.
Hey, Dean, tell about how you got involved in this, because you'd heard about Gary's work, right? And then began using it in your forecasting up in the Dakotas.
I did. Well, and I was introduced to this when I worked in Nebraska. Gary worked right down the road in Kansas City. So I reached out to Gary. I said, hey, I'm really interested in this LRC. You know, I've been kind of following along on your blog, and I'd like to know more about it. So Gary taught me how to use it. And I'll tell you what, when I first started using it, because you're not taught this in meteorology when you go to college, and that's the goal. We would love to see this get put into universities, so the up and coming meteorologists will learn how to use this, and this will become more mainstream. So I reached out to Gary and started using this in Nebraska, and then when I moved up here to North Dakota, I got LRC certified. I believe there's only, I think, 10 of us or so in the country, Gary, that, and if I'm wrong, correct me, but meteorologists in the country that are certified on how to use the LRC. And I'll tell you what, it's a game changer is the easiest way to put it. It's an extra tool in your tool belt, and it's a major piece of long-term weather forecasting, and the accuracy on it has just been amazing. And we've helped, I don't know how many farmers up here. There's between 50 and 100 in the ag community up here in the Dakotas and Minnesota that have signed up for the LRC, and we're hoping to expand that throughout the country as well.
So let's get into this then. Gary, this LRC, should we say, kind of sets up every fall. It's new, a new pattern. Tell me, what would be the difference from 2024 to 2025 in the pattern? Are you looking at big shifts in what the LRC will be as we look ahead to this new year?
It's a huge difference. Last year's pattern was last year's pattern. This year's pattern is this year's pattern. One of the aspects, one of the core principles of the LRC is every year is unique. So the pattern we are experiencing now is very different than last year. I think we can all agree. And how it impacts each location is going to be different. So yes, the pattern sets up in the fall, and around October 5th, 6th, or 7th is we identify usually when it's day one of the pattern. We are now already into beginning the third cycle of this pattern as we go into the middle of January here. It's the third cycle already. It's a shorter cycle this year, and it's going to be fascinating to watch unfold. And we have some new findings just, Dean and I briefly talked about it a few days ago, but as I said, the LRC provides the where, the when, and some of the what. But the Arctic oscillation, which dipped negative about a week or 10 days ago, caused that cold Arctic air, or resulted in the Arctic air coming down. And then La Nina, which has sort of got a grip on the Corn Belt. La Nina is the cooling of the tropical Pacific Ocean, and that grip that it has tends to shift precipitation patterns to the eastern Corn Belt. That's not good for Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, and North Dakota, South Dakota. It shifts precipitation patterns to the east, but that grip we think is going to be let loose by March.
So let's talk about what we may have in store for the rest of winter. So far, it has been wetter to the south and to the east, and it has been drier in the north. The Dakotas, Minnesota, well below in snowfall so far. Does that pattern continue as we move toward March?
It's good because Dean predicted that it was going to be a low snow year, didn't you, Dean, for North Dakota?
Yeah, not as bad as last year, but not far off. And last year was one of the least snowiest winters we've had. So,
right.
Yeah. No.
When I was on in North Dakota with Dean on his show up there just a few weeks ago for the winter forecast, I clearly thought, and now I'm going to confirm, I really feel strongly about this, that there will be a big ending to winter in North Dakota, because there's going to be some big upper level lows that form around four corners and lift out. So North Dakota may have a late heavy snow season in March and April. So that's one thing that I see happening. But there are these phases. Dean, have you noticed the two main phases of the weather pattern this season?
Yeah, there's that wet phase, which we're in right now with the Central Plains low coming into shape and actually exiting the area. And there's a dry northwesterly flow, which has been pretty dominant, at least up here in the Dakotas and Minnesota, where most of these storms, even in the wet phase, have been down to our south through Nebraska, Kansas, southern Iowa, off into the Great Lakes. Southern Minnesota has been clipped by a few of those systems early in the cycle, but two different, totally different parts to the cycle: a wet phase and then a dry, cold northwesterly flow.
Right, and in the wet phase, Andrew, we have this part of the pattern that produces about 8 different storm systems. In the first cycle, October to the end of November, there were 8 of these systems. Then we go to the northwest flow, and there are systems in northwest flow, but they're just not as pronounced and strong. Maybe over near the East Coast they are. And then it shifts back to the 8 storms. Based on what we know as of this moment, and this will be adjusted in the next couple of weeks till the end of January, but this wetter phase of the pattern is January. It's going to return January 19th to February 16th, give or take a few days. March 1st to March 28th, April 11th to May 5th, and May 22nd to June 18th. I'm very excited here, as you can see. But when that returns, that La Nina stranglehold on the pattern probably doesn't mean it's really wet January 19th to February 16th. But the March version, and especially the April versions, could be quite wet. And this, understanding the LRC, having our Weather 2020 Vision dashboard as your tool, you can see which weeks will be wet, which weeks will be most likely dry in your area, and you can plan for planting, growing, and then harvest seasons.
Gary, when you're talking about those wet times in March and April, is that mostly northern plains, or is that the entire Midwest into the eastern Corn Belt? What's the area of that wet pattern in those months?
In October, when the pattern first began evolving, there was a very wet storm in northern New Mexico. It went into southern Colorado, but it didn't get up to Denver, for example. Okay, so Denver stayed dry, where it got really wet from around Pueblo, Colorado Springs down into Roswell to Santa Fe, New Mexico, Albuquerque area. That shows you how it can be very wet in one location, and yet just north of it, it's dry. So there are going to be these dry pockets. If you're in one of them where it has been dry, there's an increased probability it's going to continue to be dry, even if the wet expands your way. I think they're literally going to be dry pockets, but most of the Corn Belt, including the Dakotas, before spring is over, is going to get adequate rainfall. That's what I see at this moment.
Dean, I suppose that's what you've been sharing with farmers up in the northern Corn Belt, what you're seeing for March and April and heading into spring planting?
100%. Everybody's been asking, it's been a dry start to winter. I said this winter is going to be backloaded. In other words, March, April, that's when we're going to get the majority of our precip. I'm going to pull in my calendar here. We had a huge storm come in here November 19th and 20th. And this was the majority of the precip we received here in the Dakotas. We received over 1.5 inches of rain, followed by 2 to 4 inches of snow. That was the big wet system that Gary was talking about. Although it's dry during the cycle in January, as we head later in the winter and especially into early spring, that's the same thing, the same system that's going to cycle back and give us the adequate moisture as we head into early spring and late winter. So that's good news for the farmers. We need that. And if you're a farmer and you're in agriculture, and we've got a farmer that subscribes to the LRC up here, and from last year, we predicted a very wet 2-week period. And it was a 2 to 3 week wet period, and he got his crops planted in early, while other farmers around him did not. And he said he had a 7 to 10 bushel difference by using the LRC and being able to plant those crops on time a little early, while others had to wait after that extremely wet cycle to even get anything in the ground. So that's just one great example of how the LRC can help.
Right. Gary, what do you see then as for temperature as we move through the winter?
Above average. I mean, we're going to have these cold outbreaks. The one that came down here in January, how long does that last? The part of the pattern that produced that is going to cycle back through. In the first cycle, it wasn't that cold. The second cycle was a little bit colder. So what does that mean? The third cycle, there's a 50-50 chance it'll turn really, really cold. So we'll monitor that. But overall, the LRC model shows above average temperatures over the entire nation. So now first day of summer. Summer's a wild card. We'll have to see what we think by then, but it could lead to a hotter summer, but let's see where that precipitation falls. So that's an impact as well.
Mm-hmm. That was going to be my next question then for you. With the LRC, you kind of have an idea of the pattern, but how far then out can we predict? So right now, what can you tell us about the spring going into the summer, whether it's precip, temperatures across the Corn Belt?
For example, the severe weather predictions is a good example. We identify like the storm that just produced the tornadoes in the southeast United States a couple weeks ago, right at about the end of the year, first of the year. That part of the pattern that produced that will cycle back through. We've identified other parts of the pattern that are going to produce severe weather. So it's like in October, November, and December, in the first cycle or two of the LRC, these little weather seeds are planted. Seeds for what may be a severe weather outbreak, a seed of what may be a tropical storm or hurricane, a seed of the drought that's going to grow, a seed of flooding, a big flooding event. You have all these weather seeds that sort of get planted in the fall. And then as you go through January into February, before severe weather season arrives, you can predict when those will form into severe weather outbreaks. So by January, we can now, with a 91% accuracy level, predict when and where there's going to be severe weather outbreaks occurring across the United States, all the way through September. So, because this same pattern we're in now is going to continue until the very end of September, when it evolves and transitions into next year's weather pattern. So in January, February is 1 month, March 2, April 3, just like May is 4, June is 5, July is 6, August is 7. So 7 to 8 months in advance is the sweet spot of the LRC, and that fits agriculture perfectly. It fits energy trader for natural gas, for example, perfectly, the January to September timeframe. Late September, October, November, we're in a transition. Maybe the LRC is not nearly as accurate then, but then it kicks in again next December to January. So about 8 months. And if you look back, when we predict the hurricanes for next season, you're going to look back at that. I'll show you the seed for that hurricane in October or November. So it's really a 10-month to an 11-month possibility of predicting a major weather event like a hurricane.
As you look ahead, then, you mentioned the severe weather. Does it look like a more active pattern for this year with severe weather as we move to the spring and summer?
I'm not sure. And the reason I say that is last year it was not that active in the fall. And then it was a very active spring. So this year has again been rather quiet in the fall. So I would lean towards it not being as active, but last year I would have been wrong. And I didn't go with that last year. I went with here are our predictions, and they happened at a 91% clip, but it was much more active than it would have indicated in the fall. The storm systems didn't produce in the fall and early winter, but they did produce in the spring. So we have to look and see why, and we'll get better and better in our forecasts as we go forward.
And I'm worried about some of these systems coming out, as you said, Gary, in March and April, that could potentially not only be big precip makers in the Dakotas. Those are the ones I'm kind of watching for the potential for severe weather, like a late spring severe weather event.
And Dean, you're right. In November, we can have a really strong storm, and that'll produce a severe weather outbreak. But the weaker storm systems may produce severe weather in April, May, and June. The days are much longer in May than they are in November. So the sun sets earlier, there's not as much heating, and that's how a storm system that might not produce much severe weather in November will when it gets to April and May.
Dean, I'm betting you're out doing some of those farmer programs already, or you've got some on the books. So as you're out there talking to farmers, what are you telling them? Because I'm sure the question they're asking you is, what kind of growing season am I going to have? So how do you answer that question right now for them?
Well, the first thing I tell them is the first thing they're worried about is this upcoming spring and early summer, like right when we're in that planting season. Is it going to be as dry as it has been? Yeah, we got adequate moisture in November. December was dry. January is going to end up being drier than normal. And I tell them, again, according to the LRC, this will be backloaded. So we'll get our moisture that we need in March and more than likely into the first part of April. So that should be good for planting season. Again, now we've got to time it out because you don't want that 2 or 3 week stretch where it's going to end up delaying your planting. You want to be able to time this out where you can get everything in the ground. And then if you want the wet period, perfect. So, and again, that's where the LRC comes in handy. But I do foresee a wetter spring, at least March and April, than it has been for the first part of or the last part of fall and into early winter. So that's good. That is good news, somewhat.
Right. It appears over the last year or so that the areas of drought, as we look at the entire nation, have begun to decrease. Do we continue to have that type of pattern, or as we look at the entire nation, are there areas of drought that could be expanding, or is it just too early to know?
Let's watch the drought monitor from week to week, because droughts are always either shrinking or expanding. This one has been shrinking for weeks, and that is a good sign. And so let's see if that trend continues. The likelihood of it continuing is high. There's a momentum that happens with these droughts. Either the drought's expanding or it's shrinking. So right now, the fact that it's shrinking, there's a few spots I'd like to see it shrink more, but if it doesn't rain or snow there, it's not going to. But those are the pockets I talk about. Overall, it's been a shrinking trend, and I expect that to continue.
In the time we have left, and I'll let either one of you take this or both of you weigh in, any other things as we look at the nation that you would say, hey, watch out for this. This is something I see, because as we talk, we tend to focus a lot on the Midwest or where we grow corn and soybeans. But hey, the weather is important in all places of the nation. So either of you, what do you see out there that we should be aware of?
I'll go with one, Dean. You can think of one if you have one. But
sure.
Raphael is a hurricane that formed late in the season in November and tracked across through the Yucatan Channel and into the Gulf of Mexico. It weakened and fell apart, but you might not have seen it, but there was a hint of it that went right into Louisiana. So that is one of those seeds. An actual hurricane, Raphael, that happened within the first cycle of the LRC. We're going to be able to predict when and where that's going to be tracking and forming. So that's something to pay attention to. That's just a symptom and a hint of hurricane based on this. Then severe weather outbreaks, winter storms, and any significant weather is predictable on some level. And we're getting better and better at it. So just watch for Hurricane Raphael. It won't be Raphael. It'll be it might be the A, B, or C storm of next summer.
Dean?
The only concern I really have is these storms that are coming in March and April that should affect the northern plains to alleviate the dryness. I'm still concerned about the western Dakotas into areas of Montana and Wyoming. I'm worried about them remaining dry. And again, because if they don't get the moisture in March and April, I think there could be a problem heading into the summer. Little too early to be able to tell exactly, but that's the way it's kind of setting up right now. It's also been extremely dry in the desert Southwest, from Southern California all the way through Southern Arizona. I don't think they've hardly had a drop of rain so far this late fall into early winter. And outside of monsoon season, Gary, do you see that changing much in the desert?
The only thing that can happen is Southern California often doesn't have precipitation in October, but when it's going to be a very wet year, they will, because that's a seed that's going to return.
Sure.
This year, as dry as it has been out there, it's probably going to continue. But in those wet periods, when those storms come into the West Coast, as soon as La Nina weakens a little bit, loosens its grip on us, some storms may penetrate into California at the last thing, and they'll call it the Miracle March or something. It'll be from dry to all of a sudden wet, just as winter comes to a close. Right. Otherwise, you're right. They're going to have near record low totals if that doesn't happen.
Gary, any things that you would tell us to look at globally? Because, you're in touch with the ag industry, and what happens here is important, but what happens around the globe? Any things that you're watching globally?
Yeah, the Southern Hemisphere, Brazil, Argentina, big key agriculture regions, they have a cycling pattern itself. It's an LRC down in the Southern Hemisphere that there isn't as much land in the Southern Hemisphere, but there is a cycle down there as well. So the LRC model will work for that area. And then for areas of Asia and Russia and whatever that have also big corn, soybean implications, the model is global. So we do have global data to monitor and track that area. But, I'm not the ultimate expert of that area, but it definitely is, I'd have to do a little analysis and I could probably have a better answer for you.
Sure. Hey, Dean, to wind up, as I mentioned, you're out there visiting with a lot of farmers. How do you best direct them to some of this information that we've been talking about? Because we've alluded to it. How do you direct them there?
Sure. I just tell them to Gary's company is weather2020.com. You can log on to Gary's website and find all the information that you want on there to be able to sign up for the LRC. And again, like I said, since I've been up here in North Dakota, Minnesota area, we've signed up between about 50 to 100 in our ag community. And like I said, we've got nothing but positive feedback. Is it 100% correct? No, nothing is. But it's a great tool, like I said, to have in your tool belt if you're in the ag community. It's tax deductible at the end of the year, so that's always good as well. And if you can get a kind of a step up on your competition and increase your yield because you know what's coming up down the road, to me that's priceless if I'm in the ag community, for sure.
Dean and Gary, I appreciate the time, and we'll see what the year brings us.
Thank you so much for having us. And yeah, let's watch this pattern cycle, and it's going to be fun to watch. It's a little frustrating at times, but then it's rewarding when the storm happens when you predicted it.
Thanks so much, Andrew.